From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the African and Middle Eastern Division. I'm delighted that you're all here. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African Middle East Division. And, you know, it's a bit sad that I'm here because usually we have Peggy Pearlstein here. She was the head of the Hebraic section, and she just retired. And this is a big loss for all of us. So I'm here, and we must carry on, and that's what we're doing. And as most of you already know, our division is made up of 3 sections: the Hebraic section, the African section, and the Near East section. We're responsible for materials for 78 different countries, from throughout the continent of Africa, from the Middle East, from Central Asia, from the Caucasus. And it's not that we just collect materials and have them in our stacks and sort of bring them up, you know, now and then when a scholar needs them. What we also like to do is to inform and let people know about the countries that we are responsible for. And the best way, I think, is by having scholars, by having poets, by having writers who have worked and who have used those collections come out and tell us, give us a particular aspect of the culture, the society, the people, the art, the architecture, and tell us and inform us about it and teach us. And I've learned so much from our speakers. And we also do exhibits, and most of you must have seen the beautiful Words Like Sapphire exhibit that was here on the Hebraic book. There's also a book that Peggy Pearlstein edited on the Myron Weinstein lecture series that was here. So that's another way, exhibits, publication of books. It's another way that we share what we have with everyone else. And today, to my great joy, we have a poet, and it's wonderful to have a poet because a poet brings a dimension to the library that is needed. It calls upon the spirit, the thought of our books and our literature. And we have Rick Black, who will be reading from his award-winning book, entitled Star of David, Poems. And I was looking him up. I'm not an expert in this, but I was looking him up, and there were rave reviews everywhere. And I found one who said that he was asked for a blurb for the book that he has written, and part of it is in the book. But I loved a sentence that he mentioned. And he said, "Who among us could fail to identify with a poet who wants to sing of horseradish, of toy frogs, of dancing with his daughter until they fall down?" And I thought, how lovely. You know, this is the spirit of joy that poets can share with us when they write. So I'm going to stop here. And let our own scholar, Dr. Ann Brenner, who's a writer, an author, both academic and in fiction, something we share, introduce our guest today. So, Ann, thank you.
I hate to contradict you right off. And we are very sorry that Peggy isn't with us, but it's not sad that you're here at all. Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to the reading room of the African and Middle Eastern Division. We have a very special program today, and the honor to introduce to you a very special poet, Rick Black, a poet who is local and not local, and a publisher and a journalist to boot. Rick's latest work is entitled Star of David. It's up there on the screen. And as far as I can tell, just like Mary Jane said, the critics are simply standing in line to sing its praises. One critic talks about the distilled purity of the book's imagery, and another, Gary Rendsburg, who was one of my own professors back at Cornell, and so I have to agree with him, writes that the poet captures the essence of Jewish ritual and culture. Rick's Star of David has, moreover, just been named a winner of the Contemporary Jewish Writing Chapbook Contest for 2012 by Poetica magazine, and that's a very prestigious prize indeed. Congratulations. Now, the Star of David, that is the term, not the book, the term, is the English equivalent of what is known in Hebrew as Magen David, that is, the Shield of David. It has a long history, this Shield of David, but it begins its journey through Jewish texts without reference to the six-pointed star we know today as the Jewish star or the Star of David, symbol of the Jewish people. Rick Black took this Star of David, or Shield of David, and wove it into his book in a way that only a poet can do, with imagination and love and great sensitivity. In order to complement his creative offering, the Hebraic section has put together a small display of rare material documenting the Shield of David in text and image. And we hope that afterwards you will enjoy this part of the program as well. It's back there. So let us now turn the podium over to our speaker and give a warm welcome to poet Rick Black.
Thank you very much, Mary Jane and Anne, and to everyone here who took time to share part of their day with me. I really appreciate your being here. I want to talk a little bit about the genesis of the book, Star of David, and in particular, its connection to my brother, Bruce, who's with us today from Sarasota, Florida. The book is dedicated to him, and the fact is that I went down to Florida in June because he needed to have an operation. He needed to have brain surgery on a benign tumor. And thank God everything went okay. And when the doctor came out of the operating room, after about, 6, 7, 8 hour operation, he came and spoke with myself and Bruce's wife, Susan, and he did a double take when he saw me. He says, "Didn't I just operate on you?" So it was wonderful to be there and to be able to help him. And when I got home from Florida, there was a message on the answering machine from me. And the message was from Michal, the editor of Poetica magazine, telling me that I had won the contest. So it was very moving to me, and so it's very moving for me to be here today, especially with Bruce and so many loved ones here in the audience. You know, I thought if I ever would be speaking here, that I would be speaking about a book that I'm making. I work both as a poet and a book artist, and I'm making a book now about Yehuda Amichai called The Amichai Windows, and it'll be a limited edition of 18 poems of Yehuda's. And I thought, perhaps one day I'll be able to speak here about that, but I never dreamed I'd be speaking about my own collection of poems or reading from my own collection of poems. And this book really evolved out of my work on the Amichai book. And I'll tell you what happened. I was at another archive over at George Washington University, the Edward Kiev archive. And I was doing research for the Amichai book. I was looking for graphic design materials to go with the poems. And so they brought out some watercolors by Marcel Jenko, and they brought out a 15th century manuscript and some anti-Semitic materials that they had from all over the world. And when I looked in the online records, I saw that they had a Star of David, an actual Star of David, in the archives. And I thought, I've never seen or held a Star of David myself. I thought, well, I'm not sure I need it for my book, but let me take a look. So they brought it out, and it came in just a small white rectangular box, and inside it was covered by gauze paper. And I wasn't sure I wanted to open the box, Did I really want to reopen that chapter of history? But like, what's the famous woman? Pandora. Like Pandora, of course, I did open it. And I held the star in my hands. It was much different than I had anticipated. It was not a bright yellow, it was a darker yellow, and it wasn't a smooth material, it was like burlap. And in the center of the star was the word Yehuda, Jew, Jude, and brought back so many memories for me. My grandfather came over from Poland long before the war. And I remember he used to sit in our kitchen. We would have coffee and Danish that he would bring. He was a baker, so he'd come over early with fresh Danish, and he'd tell us all kinds of stories, his wandering across Europe as an orphan, and how he'd be called Geflickte Jude. That's what he'd be called on the train or wherever he might be. So I held the star in my hands, and I took a picture or two, and I jotted down a few lines. And when I got home, I finished the poem. And that really was the genesis for this book. I've been writing poetry for a number of years, kind of wrestling with my own Jewish heritage. And so I took a bunch of those poems and put them together. And I sent it off to the contest and was lucky enough to win. So I'd like to start with the first poem of the collection, Star of David. Star of David. I am loth to open the archival box in which it is kept. Yet I cannot resist and delicately lift the top to find white gauze, beneath which is a hint of yellow, a precious jewel. I unwrap it slowly, the infamous word Yehuda, so naked, so innocent, so dark. The graceful letters set against the yellow star. Where has it been, this scrap of cloth? Who wore it? Long forgotten. In which ghetto? Go ahead. Try to calculate its weight, resting in my hand, a swallowtail that can no longer fly. The next poem I'd like to read also deals with my attempts to make sense of Jewish history. It's called The Wall, and it's named for the Western Wall, which is probably the most famous and holiest site in Jewish religion. But I mean, when I say the wall, I don't only mean a physical site. I also am talking in this poem about the borders of language, how far language can take us. And sometimes language is a bridge, and sometimes language is a road, and sometimes it's a wall. And each time it's different depending on how people use it. And the poem has a epigraph by a dear friend and mentor of mine, Kwame Dawes. And this is just a brief line. "We have stumbled into language." Comes from a poem of his entitled Midland. This poem is called The Wall. I am stranded at the border crossing of language and try to explain to the guard who blocks my way, "You know, I never got a number at Auschwitz, but I was there with the others." "All right," he barks, "I'll let you go ahead this time." While chassids pray fervently, dusk descends on the old city's domes. I stumble over words strewn in my path. Hesitantly, I approach the wall's ashlar blocks of pain. Dozens of prayer slips jut out of its crevices. Others have fallen to the ground like gambling chits. Tell me of your sorrow, whisper it to me, and I'll tell you mine. A weary traveler, I long to cry out like the ancient prophet, be comforted, my people. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But I remain silent, still. I cannot decipher its stones either from right to left or left to right. They are inscribed in an alphabet of suffering, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Auschwitz, Babi Yar, Gusen. Our Father, our King, Avinu Malkeinu, pardon us, forgive us aboard this rickety ship, caught in the whirlpool of Jewish history, trying to avoid Scylla and Charybdis. While listening to the sirens, I try to loosen my bonds and cry out, let me go, but I am bound to the mast like Odysseus with the black straps of my tefillin. I try to touch the rough-hewn stones, but cannot move my arms or hands. Instead, I incline my forehead against their coolness. Involuntarily, the words of the Kaddish rise to my lips. Itgadal, Itkadash, Shmei Rabbah. Perhaps the prayer itself is enough, or just the silence of the rocks, the fallen slips of paper, the outgrowth of shrubs, the circling doves. And perhaps this is the only solace that will ever come. Yes, perhaps this is the only solace that will ever come. The next poem that I'd like to read is called My Grandfather's Prayer Book. And I brought it with me, actually, to show you. It's pretty beaten up. And it just shows we need a bookbinder to mend it. And if you look inside, all Hebrew. And some of the pages, just from turning the corners, it's a devotion with which he would read this book. So this poem is called My Grandfather's Prayer Book. Only recently have I come to understand that my grandfather's prayer book the one I inherited from him, is a treasure box of keys. Its ancient, blood-stained alphabet transports me places that I have only dreamed of going: Poland, Europe, Babylonia, Egypt. The partially erased Hebrew letters bind me to his thin, willowy frame. We all need to bend in the wind, don't we? To his shock of white hair, to his tranquil, ocean-weary eyes, and to the cigar stub that often dangled between his lips. They bind me to distant stars and to him stooped over in the living room of his apartment on 243rd Street in the Bronx, with the picture of his youngest son, Ben, killed in World War II, to an aroma of roasting brisket and a shelf filled with bottles and pills, to an overheated apartment where a large wooden television console broadcasts a Yankee game and red geraniums are flowering on the windowsill. I was slightly afraid of his shuffling to and fro, unable to walk without a heavy-set aide pulling him along, like a tugboat assisting a fragile ship to a cushioned harbor. We often played checkers. I remember how he nudged a round piece to another square with his tobacco-tinted fingertips. He didn't ever let me win. And afterwards, as everyone sat in the living room chatting towards evening, he would daven Mariv, the evening prayer service, mumbling words from his prayer book while barely looking down. I sit by the Yortzeit plaques in shul, some lit up in memory of a loved one, others still blank. I stare silently at the stained glass windows, just as he used to stare beyond the neighboring fire escapes. Resting in my hands is his tattered prayer book. Its pages are torn or worn away, and some words have flaked off. But I still take it with me to shul and use it to remember him and to dream of distant places, even if my own faith is torn like a talit. Next poem is a short one, also has to do with prayer. It's called "The Lord is My Shepherd." The Lord is my shepherd. I shall want to know one day why God made hurricanes and floods and rested on the seventh day. I shall want to know one day why God sent down famine and disease and rested on the seventh day. I shall want to know one day why God rested on the seventh day, but did not grant us any rest. But speaking of rest, there's one way not to get any rest, and my daughter manages to take care of that. She's 9 years old now, and it's wonderful that I don't get a lot of rest because of her. And this next poem that I'm going to read is called "Swings." We used to go to a park near our home in New Jersey, and she would run from one. There was six different swings all in a row. So she would run from one to the other and try to keep them all going at the same time. So that's what I was trying to capture in this poem. Swings for Melly. My 5-year-old daughter pushes each of the swings, narrow, black bands of rubber attached to metal chains, beneath the shade of unknown trees. She runs from one swing to another to keep them all going simultaneously. One for Uncle Bruce, another for Aunt Susan, one for Grandpa David, another for Grandma Adele, one for Nana, another for Papa. The dead are invited too, one for Grandpa Harry, another for Grandma Goldie, One for Uncle Nate, another for Aunt Alberta. It's a family reunion where relatives show up whom she'll never meet except in color or black and white photos before they fade away. And speaking of children, you always have to read a poem about Pesach when you talk about children. And this poem is called The Passover Seder. I kind of have a love and hate relationship to Passover, as I imagine many people do. You know, I'm not crazy about the cleaning, and I'm not crazy about the taste of the matzah and all that stuff. I miss bread as much as everybody else, but there are certain parts of it that I really love, and one of it is the chance to eat fresh ground horseradish. And the first time that I ever had that, I went to visit, we had a pharmacist in our town called Mr. Bressler, and he was dying of cancer at the time. And his wife, she was a wonderful cook. And I went to visit to see him, to say hello, and she was preparing for Pesach, and she was grating fresh horseradish. And I'd never seen that before. And so she said, come on over, you can do it too. Not knowing, so I went over and I did it, and I cried. It was really very, very strong stuff. So this poem is called The Passover Seder. I want to sing of horseradish, the strong, beet red, eye-popping, gullet-burning horseradish that makes you grab for a glass of water like a life preserver. I want to sing of dancing in the living room, spinning round and round with my daughter to celebrate our survival in the desert until we cannot spin anymore and land upon the floor. I want to sing of toy frogs leaping above the Seder table and making everyone laugh hysterically. I want to sing of Dai Daienu, Dai Daienu, but not to sing it over and over. I don't want to sing of slavery and the splitting of the Red Sea and the drowning of the Egyptians. I do not want to sing of the dead and the blood and the darkness. I want to sing of tenderness, of moist honey cake and almonds, of brisket smothered in onions, of dozing off in my father's arms. At this point, I'd like to ask Aaron Taub, who's a wonderful poet in his own right and works here at the library. I kind of like to hear multiplicity of voices, so if you would read this next poem. It's called At the Intersection of Grief and Solace. And I was kind of amazed when I moved here that a road near my house, where we're living now in Arlington, Virginia, is called Washington Boulevard, because the main road where I grew up in Bergenfield, New Jersey, was called Washington Avenue. So I just kind of did a compare and contrast there. So if you would. No, page 5. Thank you.
Okay. At the Intersection of Grief and Solace by Rick Black. I locate myself at the intersection of grief and solace. It's a relatively empty street corner, kind of like a Hopper painting at night. You know the one, in the diner. There's an element of comfort and solace in being lonely in the darkness. I stroll down Washington Avenue, my childhood boulevard of dreams, of chocolate milkshakes at Dairy Queen, of 4th of July fireworks in Memorial Park, and picnics in our backyard. I played chess for hours with Uncle Nate, back from the war, while watermelon was served. Now I live near Washington Boulevard, in a town of spies and memorials. Almost all of my relatives are gone. It's a comfort to wander from one memorial to another, touching the granite, marble, and alabaster. I locate myself at the intersection of grief and solace, occupying it like a homeless man who refuses to be taken to a shelter in the cold.
Thank you very much. Like Yehuda Amichai, I like to play with Jewish religious texts, changing around words and creating new metaphors sometimes. And he did that a lot with the Bible. Well, I find that I gravitate more towards the prayer book and prayers and poems that are in the Siddur. And in this next poem, it's not the prayer book itself, but the very idea of observance that I like to toy with. You'll see. Observance. I am not observant. I do not walk to shul or refrain from cooking on Shabbat. But I do practice observance as often as possible, watching geese descend on their wings into the river, listening to a red-bellied woodpecker, lunatic, in my backyard, and inhaling the fragrance of wild lilac along a forest path. Another one in that same vein, hands. I watch others pass by, pushing strollers, carrying talit bags, wearing yarmulkes, and I imagine them in shul, reciting ancient prayers, their hands uplifted to God. And yet, I would rather be here, bent, prostrate, nurturing the arugula seedlings that I sowed, hunched over in torn jeans and invisible phylacteries. I worship with them daily, my co-worshipers, and use my weather-beaten hands to dig into the soil, to clear away the stones. I find myself, I guess I haven't talked a whole lot about my background. I lived in Israel for 6 years. I studied Hebrew literature at Hebrew University for 2 of those years, 3 of those years. And for 3 years, I was a reporter in the Jerusalem bureau of the New York Times. And I felt the need, writing as a reporter is one thing, and writing as a poet is a completely different way of using words and trying to get at experience. And so I often find myself, different ways for me of taking solace is through writing or through nature, through family. Those are the things that I write about most. And this poem's for my wife, Laura. It's called A Shower of Words. Your tiny shoulders, on which I have put so much weight, my love. If only I was water flowing down your breasts, glistening in the light, streaming down your thighs, cascading past your sky blue eyes, I would caress you forever. The rain has almost stopped. Last night we heard it pouring, its scent wafting through our bedroom window, which was open just a crack to let in the riotous air of Jerusalem. If only I knew how to caress you with words, my love, a shower of words, if only. And I often take solace in language, the Hebrew language itself. I basically lived in the Hebrew-English Reuben Alkali dictionary for months at a time and paging through its thick pages looking for various people learn language just through hearing it and in conversation. But I'm not one of those people. I have to see it and write it, and then it sticks, and after I use it a couple of times. So this poem is called The Complete Hebrew-English Dictionary. I live in Reuben Alkali's dictionary. At least it feels that way, given the amount of time I spend there each day. It's not too uncomfortable, especially in the middle of the book, where there's a pillow for my head when I have to drowse off. I love to stop here and there to visit unfamiliar verbs, nouns, and adjectives. There's no need to call or make an appointment. I'm always welcome. I like that informality, especially in the morning when they offer me a cup of tea or coffee. Often neighbors drop in unannounced, a lead weight, a feather, a wave, a taxi driver who drives off and takes me to unexpected places, free of charge. I love these detours in the land of my ancestors, the words guiding me through the countryside. It's the way to travel and reminds me who I am and where I come from. Yehuda Amichai has been a very large influence on my life. I met him when I was a press liaison at the Israeli consulate in Philadelphia. We brought him in as a keynote speaker for a conference on Jewish identity. So he came with his wife Chana. And I met them at Penn Station in Philadelphia. And he was a very down-to-earth guy. He's coming up the stairs there and he's lugging, you know, the chassids, they have these big, gigantic, like leather suitcases and stuff. So that's what, and he's not religious. I mean, he was brought up Orthodox, but he wasn't Orthodox. He left that. Still very religious, but not observant. So he's lugging along this suitcase, and I say, Yehuda, let me help you with the bag. He said, no. Everybody has to lug their own, everybody has their own baggage. So I would get whatever time I had and talk with him as a young, aspiring poet. And whenever we would be in the lobby of the hotel after his reading or something like that, and he'd be smoking his pipe, a very nice kind of cherry tobacco aroma. And I would ask him questions, and so I would jot down what he said. And so I thought I would share a couple of comments that he had about being a poet, if I can find them here. Should be here somewhere. Here we go. So this is Yehuda Amichai. He says, some people make marmalade from the apple that Newton saw and which served as his basis for deductions about gravity. Others make poetry. It all depends on how one sees it. He says, a poem is a poem if it grasps you, if you want to return to it, if it gives you the feeling of being a poem, then it's a poem. He says, above all else, one must enjoy one's writing and take pleasure in it. That's all it comes down to. It's a matter of falling in love with some aspect of life and a desire to express that in words. And I'd like to read a little bit from the introduction to Star of David, where I talk about our meeting. And then I'm going to ask Anne to read a poem that I dedicated to Yehuda in the collection. I had the honor of escorting Yehuda and his wife Hannah around Philadelphia. He had come as our keynote speaker for a conference on Jewish identity. We spent a lot of time together that weekend, the pleasant aroma of his pipe filling the air while we talked about poetry. How do you know when a poem is done? How can love and poetry be helpful in trying to deal with war? And he said, love won't save you from war, but it can help you deal with the pain. Poetry can help too. Words help me regain a balance in my life. You have to accept life on its own terms. If you try to fight it, you'll break. And for a young poet like myself, listening to and talking with Amichai was like a tonic. I loved being able to share my questions and aspirations with him. And indeed, as he suggested, writing has helped me to understand and accept the coexistence of beauty and suffering. In truth, writing is my own form of prayer and consolation. It eases a sense of loneliness and helps me appreciate the beauty of the world, as well as deal with grief. And I hope that some of these poems I've been reading will do so for others here today. And if you'd be so good as to read the Amichai poem. You know what page it's on?
Not,
It's a small book. Oh, here it is, Planet with 7 Rings.
A Planet with 7 Rings for Yehuda Amichai by Rick Black. The rain comes down on the roof and on the ground, on the streets and on the windshields. A poet was alive yesterday, but is no more. A Shabbat candle is still lit in this rainy evening. There are poems that he will not write, lonely walks that he will not take, books that he will not read. I set out for a lengthy walk. The screen door slams shut behind me. I open an umbrella and descend into the glistening rain, stopping by a street light to watch it sparkling. And still the rain comes down. They say there is a planet with 7 rings. Perhaps there is another without hatred, without slaughter, without pain.
Just read a few more poems and then we can take some questions and answers. And if there's time, maybe I could read one of Amichai's poems. We'll see. This poem is called The Hebrew School. My daughter slowly repeats the Hebrew vowels and consonants, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, in a whisper. Slowly they rise, invisibly filling the room with their essence. May the letters lead her to a passion for learning in Jerusalem or elsewhere. And may she never have to carry a gas mask kit like a school lunchbox. A lot of times as a reporter, I would have to cover bombings or demonstrations. And you'll notice whenever there's some kind of a terrorist attack, the reporters always want to know how many dead and how many wounded and where did the person get hit. But they never say how many firefighters came to help out, how many ambulance workers came, how many people were in the hospital stitching people back together. And so that's what I was trying to get at with this poem. It's called Even If I Can't See Your Hands. After the bomb explodes the sky, and blood flows in the street, and the sound of sirens racing, hands reach out to lift, to support, to console. It cannot be explained. And even if I can't see your hands, I know they're there, reaching out. And I think the last poem I'd like to read is called Kaddish. I wrote this while I was saying Kaddish for my dad. Kaddish. I didn't go to shul today to say Kaddish, as the law prescribes for Jews in mourning. Instead, I walked past it and turned towards the river that winds under the highway bridge and beyond my sight to the ocean. Open thou my lips to say Kaddish, like cascading hail on macadam streets, like oak trees with their mast, like the smell of old synagogues and churches, like robins, ants, and cricket carcasses, like the night darkness and stars, like the laughter of my daughter, like iris, mums, and impatience in the breeze, like a dead squirrel crushed in the street. Even when I am not reciting Kaddish, even when I protest against it, I am still reciting Kaddish. I say Kaddish, I say Kaddish, I say Kaddish. When I am silent and when I converse, when I wake and when I lie down, when I walk alone by the river and when I stand still in a field, I am saying Kaddish. Thank you.
That was just so lovely. A beautiful musical interlude in the middle of a very busy day for all of us. It was such an honor to be able to read one of your poems out loud. And, you know, while I was reading, I was very struck with one thing, Rick, I'd like to comment on. You say that you're in dialogue with Yehuda Amichai, and indeed you are. But you are very much in dialogue with some of the greatest Hebrew poets as well. While I was reading that eulogy to Yehuda Amichai, I was very much struck by, could you find me the poem, please? By one line, which he says, a poet is no more. Is that how you put it? A poet is no more. There's a great Hebrew poem by Bialik. Everyone knows Bialik. And he says, it's a poem he wrote as though for his own gravestone. He says, Achrei moti sifdu kahali haya ish v'ru'u einenu od. After my death, write this about me, that there was a poet, and behold, he is no more. While I was reading that, I was just so struck by that echo. And I found other echoes, beautiful echoes, with with the greatest Hebrew poets of the 20th century.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so are there any questions for Rick or any comments? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Could I ask that
Want me to
when you
repeat the question? On the cover?
So where did it come from? I can't decide whether it's a sort of sad and angry depiction or just a...
Yeah, the cover was done by an artist. Ruth wants to know where the Star of David that's on the cover of the book, where that came, what the background is on it. And I can't give you too much background, except I know the artist is listed here is, of course I don't have glasses, is Tanya Mauerman. And the title of the art piece is Mystical Star of David. And it was chosen by the publisher. And she sent it to me and said, what do you think? And I said, yeah, I like it very much. And so that's how it got there. But
I was trying to relate it to the poem about the actual artifact.
yeah, did not have that in mind when I wrote my particular poem, but I mentioned that I took a couple of pictures. I work a lot at Pyramid Atlantic. There's a Book Arts and over there, and so I made a print from a photo of the Star of David that I had seen, but the publisher wanted to go with the mystical Star of David, so that's what she did. But what struck me is with all the in here that Anne has put together is just to see how far back that Star of David goes in terms of Jewish tradition and how it's been used in that way for a long time. It was there was one there from the it's a complicated, all right. You want to tell us? Okay. Okay. Anybody else?
It's clear from your writings how your personal experiences and the way you've lived have inspired you. Can you comment on how your recent move to the Washington area, where you're finding your inspiration?
Well, I had that one poem, The Intersection of Grief and Solace. That's, most of my poems, they're probably inspired more by my experiences in Israel or by experiences with family, kind of regardless of where I am geographically at this particular moment. But you never know where a poem's going to hit you. So maybe there'll be one about this reading, I don't know. Should I read one more poem? You're done? Okay. Thank you.
There's a famous story about the Hebrew poet Natan Alterman who didn't want to leave his old apartment because he said, how is the muse going to find me if I move? But I think we can all agree that the muse definitely found Rick even here in Washington. So I'd like to now invite all of you to first purchase Rick's wonderful book over here on the left. I'm sure he'll be glad to sign it for you. And if you have a moment, please stop by our display of books and images relating to the history of the Star of David. It's a complicated history, and it's worth looking into. And Sharon Horowitz, my colleague, and I will be happy to show you the books right here in the middle. Please take a checklist, and thank you so much for coming. It's been a wonderful, wonderful program. Thank you so much, Rick Black. Okay.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.